perhaps not. I don't know. I mean, if the Washington 10 exists and they let the Constituent Assembly form a government, I don't know what could have happened.
Anyone else?
On the transitional period between February and October revolutions, you said that the provisional governments, as they were, still continued to support the war against Germany.
Yeah.
I mean, why were they doing that when popular sentiment seemed to be against that?
Well, I think one might have been that they were getting supplies and things from the Allies, and that would be cut off. And I think they were probably patriotic as well, because this man Sukhanov, which is this book is based upon, he records some of the things that Lenin and Trotsky were saying towards the end against the provisional government. And they were saying Kerensky is going to surrender St. Petersburg to the Germans, because the German army was advancing. They got to Riga. And anybody know anything about history? I mean, the geography of Russia. There's a place called Reval. I don't know what it's called now, but it's
Sorry?
a place called Reval, R-E-V-A-L. It must be between Riga and, well, you might know, Riga and St. Petersburg. So the German army was advancing on St. Petersburg, and the sort of propaganda that was being put out by Lenin and Trotsky and the boss was, look, the provisional government is going to betray St. Petersburg. So even they used the nationalist thing, and in fact, this woman that assassinated Lenin was doing it on patriotic grounds, because what, we give the Bolsheviks full credit for this. They stopped the war on the Eastern Front, because when they went to the negotiate with the German army at Litovsk, the Germans imposed very harsh conditions. They said, "Oh, we have half Ukraine, we'll have the Baltic states, we'll have Finland," and Trotsky and Lenin were forced to sign this because these any conditions they were going to get. But half the population was still patriotic, and they say this person shot Lenin saying you were a traitor to the Russian thing. So I think they would genuinely, the peasants weren't necessarily who were in the army weren't necessarily internationalists. But I think the provisional government was silly. I mean, if they hadn't continued the war, they might be able to survive. People make mistakes in history, I suppose, isn't it?
Right, anyone else?
Yeah, there's him.
Now.
I do have a question, but it's not about the Russian Revolution, it's about the French Revolution. Is that all right?
Try.
Okay. My understanding of the French Revolution is not drawn from Carlyle, which is apparently a masterly piece of knowledge about the French Revolution. It's drawn from Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, which I think is a rather good book. It's a fictional account, but obviously, the times are reflected in the book. It's also known as the Terror, when the guillotine killed many people. Mm-hmm. And I think in a way the Terror had its own momentum, and it became gradually used by those that held the power to do all sorts of things. But there was another terror around about that time. It was the terror of everyday working people being treated, badly, awfully. And their terror was daily, monthly, yearly, by people that had lots of money. I don't know if you call them the captain's class or whatever, or the landowners. Now, in reading that book, Tale of Two Cities, Madame Defarge stitched the names of people into a scarf that she was knitting, so that when the revolution finally came, they'd know whose heads to take off. It's my view that sort of violence is sometimes justified when people are oppressed in that way. The danger is, with that sort of violence, it gets out of control. So I have one question, well, maybe two if I get to that one. The first question is violence justifiable to bring about a socialist government or a socialist world? And secondly, no, when I remember I'll come back to the second one. Thanks.
I've actually not read the Tale of the Two Cities, but I've seen the film or read the cartoon or something. And it is a bit of prejudice, isn't it, about, you know, a bit like Lord Acton. But, I mean, you know, Marx himself was a revolutionary in the 19th century. He too studied, you know, the French Revolution, and well, I think his original conception of revolution was probably influenced by that. But he explains the terror in the French Revolution, you know, along these lines, that it was a bourgeois revolution, but the bourgeoisie itself wasn't prepared to really liquidate the old ruling class, so that these other people came in, you know, did that, and then the bourgeoisie through them. So it was, you know, that period of terror was just a point in the process of the bourgeois revolution in France. And in fact, you know, some of the Menshevik people applied this to the Bolsheviks. You know, so all you're doing is the same as happened during the terror in France. You're doing the dirty work for the Russian bourgeoisie, which they won't do. But of course, what didn't happen in Russia, which did happen in France, was that the bourgeoisie didn't come back. You know, the people who'd done this, you know, stayed in power, and they eventually evolved into being a new ruling class. But to come back to your question about is violence justifiable to establish socialism? Well, I'd say yes, all the way around. Or is, if necessary, yes. But I mean, would it be necessary? I mean, well, you can see some circumstances when it might be necessary. If, well, let's go back to the position of the Tsarist regime in February, March 1917. You know, there was people power. The army was under control of the population, wasn't under control of the government. You know, they gave up. But I mean, but supposing that there's a majority of socialist understanding that there's a majority of socialists in the various parliaments and local councils, and socialism is established. If a minority of people decide to stage an armed uprising to try and stop socialism, well then, yes, it is justified to put it down, and that's what I'd say. I think that's what most members of the Socialist Party would say, if it comes to that. I mean, so we're not absolute pacifists, but what did the Chartists say? Peaceably if we may, forcibly if we must. I mean, that seems to be the. But you know, what we're saying is that the socialist movement should conduct itself in such a way that the onus for starting any violence is going to be on the other side. And we're going to behave democratically. We're going to have a majority and get legitimacy, so that you will put yourself in a position of rebels if you resist this. And but I mean, there are all sorts of ways of dealing with it. I don't think actually how they could survive. It would be, you know, like that quote from Trotsky of the Tsarist general telegraphing the chief of police in St. Petersburg, saying, "How many troops have you got?" I mean, they'd get the answer, no, 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 and so they would give up. I mean, I would have thought that we don't know. The question wasn't, is violence necessary, but would violence ever be justified? Now, it's a different answer. I mean, violence isn't necessary. I mean, that's our position. But if you ask the question, could it ever be justified under any circumstances? The answer is yes.
Yes, but we've heard all this in
South Africa. You're asking a different question to what I was asked.
Oh, well, fair enough.
Yes, to go back to this, the question of the violence